Good morning and welcome to the latest episode in Northgate Arinzo and Reality's Coffee Break series. Today we're going to take a look at outbound web services in Reality in this, the first of a two-part presentation. But let's begin by taking a quick look at what we mean by web services. Web services in some form or another have been around since in the internet since the mid-90s, when it was realised that there was a requirement to allow, in particular business, applications to interact with each other in a seamless, standardised fashion. Up to this point, EDI had been the interface of choice for businesses, but this was often difficult and cumbersome to set up and did not interface very well with the emergent World Wide Web. XML, in the form of HTML, had been the language of choice in web development since the inception of the World Wide Web, and replacements for EDI soon began to emerge based on this technology. Early frontrunners were WIDL, the Web Interface Definition Language, and XML RPC, the XML Remote Procedure Calls. Eventually, however, work by IBM, Microsoft and others led to the standardization on three protocols. Firstly, there was SOAP, the Simple Object Access Protocol, to define the transport and messaging mechanism. Secondly, there was WSDL, the Web Service Description or Definition Language, to define the service interface, and UDDI, the Universal Description, Discovery and Integration Layer, that defined how to register and discover a web service, although this is now mainly defunct. The World Wide Web Consortium, that defines these things, currently has a definition of a web service as follows. A web service is a software system designed to support interoperable machine-to-machine interaction over a network. It has an interface described in a machine processable format, specifically WSDL. Other systems interact with the web service in a manner prescribed by its description using SOAP messages, typically conveyed using HTTP with an XML serialization in conjunction with other web-related standards. So what does all this mean in practice? And what exactly is an interface described in a machine processable format? Well, Reality, in the form of its web services architecture, has provided the necessary components in each of these four layers to be able to provide that service that meets the requirements of the definition. Firstly, there's the business rules layer, which is the Reality application, typically consisting of data basic subroutines and programs. Secondly is the component layer, which is the data basic compiler and runtime. Thirdly is the Reality Web Services layer, which defines the interface that builds the WSDL definitions based on the defined business rules. And finally, we have a presentation layer, which makes use of the WSDL via SOAP messages and puts it into an HTML typical web application. And now for that machine processable format. This is an example of a typical WSDL document that defines things about the application and the application interface layer. In this case, we're looking at a databasic subroutine called MULT, which multiplies two numbers together, x and y, and returns the element in the variable called ANS. The system itself, the location of the database and the account, is defined by this HTML document, the WS Web Services add. So as you can see, there's very little that defines the actual interface and connection. And to make this even easier, the team at Reality have designed a web-based management interface that does all this for you. So let's jump in and see how easy it is to build a web service in Reality. Before we begin, however, to use Reality Web Services, there are some prerequisites that need to be in place. Firstly, we need the correct version of Java installed. We need a Java compliant web server, and Jetty is provided as the default. That has to be installed and running. An installation of the Reality Web Services from the Reality CD or download. A Web Services key to enable the functionality. A Reality account with Web Services enabled via the Setup Account utility, and a user with the correct security permissions, and this means that Remote Basic must be enabled. The installation of these components is beyond the scope of this presentation, but full details can be found in the appropriate installation guides. So where do we start? Since the whole purpose of web services is to allow your business logic to be exposed to the outside world, let's start with a databasic subroutine. In this example, we're going to be working with a file called customer and a databasic subroutine called custtrans. This is a simple subroutine which accepts 4 parameters as the input and output. The first is action, which determines whether or not we're going to read or write data. The ID is the ID of the record we wish to read. Rec is the dynamic array of data to be returned, and ERR returns any error messages. Now let's go on to the Web Service Management Interface console. This is where we define the connectors, which define the databasic accounts and systems, and the web services themselves, which builds the WSDL document. So let's go ahead and add a new connector. The connector name is going to be called Customer, and the connector type is a reality connector. We'll give it a description. We will enable it. The name of the host in this case is localhost. The port number is 1203, the standard DDA port. The database name. The user, I've created a special user with the remote basic enabled, and the account. We can now save that connector. This now appears down the left hand side in the list of connectors. We can go off now and create the new web service using that connector. Let's call this web service customer. Give it an alias of the same name and a description. We will also enable this. We can now go ahead and determine which connector we're going to use. So if we go in the drop down, we now have the connector we created before called customer. This will then go off and look for all the databasic subroutines that were defined in the web services file. In this case there was only one, and it's called custtrans. Let's add that function. It goes off, reads the databasic subroutine interface, and determines there's 4 elements to be passed in and 4 to be passed out. Let's now save this web service. We can now look at this complex WSDL document that we saw earlier that defines the interface and the connection string. So the Web Management Console has generated this data automatically for us. So here we see the databasic subroutine named custtrans and the input parameters and the output parameters. The definition of the database is stored here in this document, WS Customer. What I'm going to do now is just take a copy of this URL so we can use it in our .NET application. Let's now move over to the C# development environment and see where we actually interface with the web services. Down here, this is where we actually use the data that we're going to pass in, and you can see here that we actually use the character separator as the reality attribute mark. We've opened up the Solution Explorer, and this is where we define web references. Let's click on that and add a new one. Typically, if you have an IIS web server running, you can actually discover these web service WSDL documents by using that interface, but we'll simply paste the one in. Hit go, and it's found the customer web service and the method custtrans, with the input strings. We'll change this to say cust service. We'll add the reference. And this is now available inside of your C# code. And the methods are also available. Now the method. And that's all there is to it. Let's go off and build this. And here we have the application running, and we'll enter the number 9876, hit return, and it returns the data for Phil Ingram. Well, that concludes this first presentation on Reality Web Services. I hope you can see how easy it is to expose databasic subroutines externally using this interface, and I look forward to you joining me for the next presentation in the Web Services series.